Yeah, I think that this afternoon we have had a very nice medley of everything, so I'm even in a more difficult position than I was in the morning, because this time it was almost impossible to find some kind of common core that I could speak about generally. So let me just address particular issues that I made note of, because definitely, if we look at the presentations, we had the traditional, we had some kind of innovative ideas here, in some of the presentations, different kind of methods, where we had corpus, we had DCTs, we had cherry-picked examples, we had questionnaires, so all kind of things. As far as the first presentation was concerned, this was basically a traditional study of complaint, speech act study, where the conclusion is always the same. There are differences and there are similarities. So nowadays, these studies are not that popular as were earlier. Some of the journals do not even accept them because, there is very little that the studies can say that is new, because, of course, no matter what speech act you take, apology, request, or whatever it is, the only thing that you will find that there are differences and similarities. And, of course, if you want to do comparative studies, the better thing is when you actually try to look at actual language use, because it was very interesting in the last presentation that you mentioned that as far as the questioner is concerned, they just didn't say anything, But I'm sure that if they were in a lifelike situation, they would use something, So I don't know Portuguese enough to say whether there is any kind of corpora available in Portuguese. Of course, you looked at the specific version, the Madeira version of Portuguese, but definitely, it would be a very good idea to kind of develop some kind of corpus material there, because these naturally occurring conversations would force the speakers in one way or another to react somehow, because if they have a questionnaire, they have time to think, and make a decision, and then they are hesitant because they think, okay, what would I really say? I don't really know, So that's the problem sometimes with questionnaires. As far as the second presentation was concerned about landscaping, it has a lot of different potentials, I think. So. Right now, I think that the project is only at the very beginning, but for me, the most important thing would be correlations, to see how different things correlate, because definitely there is some kind of correlation there, between the different things that you looked at, and I am a little bit hesitant because I was thinking about what would be better to kind of have an inductive approach or a deductive approach to the whole thing, to ask particular questions, then go to the database and try to get the answers, or just analyze the database and then, make particular conclusions. In my opinion, both should be done, because there is a lot of very important things there, that you can find in this database. I particularly found interesting that as far as the native speakers are concerned, they took more time to describe these photos that you showed them, and as far as the non-native speakers are concerned, they didn't do that. I don't know, I can just speculate here, but maybe one of the main reasons is that, when they describe something, the other languages, that they have may kind of disturb a little bit, because they may have the feeling like, okay, it would be more important and interesting for me to use a word from another language, not in English, to describe something like that. It's a feeling when sometimes, there is in Russian, there is this very nice, it's not a nice word, but it's an interesting word, vялый человек, vялый. it's impossible to use that. You know, sometimes I would like to use that in English, but there is nothing close to that. Okay. As far as the two last presentations are concerned, you know, there was some common core there because both of them were about addressing people, but you know, in Svetlana's presentation, basically there was a very interesting issue addressed because after the collapse of the communist regimes, you know, this issue, how to address people, became absolutely very important, because earlier it was simple. Everybody was comrade or tovarish, so you know, there was no problem with that. And there were some neutral, like in Russian, as far as the гражданин, that was another possibility to use, which was neutral. And later, people just didn't know how to address each other. So господин, господа, that appeared in Russian, in Serbian, as you talked about that. I found the examples interesting because I think that the example was something like Mirjana knjiga okupila drugovje. That was the example that you used there. And I think that you were right when you said this was an ironic use. Basically, that was an ironic use. And the problem is that I doubt that drugova, there was another example, stari drugova, that you used, which also shows some kind of irony. And yes, so I don't think that they will come back in any other way than irony, you know, so that's for sure. I find, you didn't mention that, but in Russian, I find especially very interesting that this word tavarish, which was used earlier all over, it is, I don't know what is happening to that right now, but it is probably not used the way as it used to, in spite of the fact that this is an old Slavic word. You know, tavar and tavarish, these were the people, you know, who exchanged goods. And originally, there is no political load attached to that. And in spite of this, you know, right now, I think that the word is absolutely out. As far as the last presentation is concerned, it was amazing to hear what kind of variety of addressing people exists in that particular variety of Portuguese. And how the different kind of influences created a situation where basically you need to use not 2 or 3 forms, but as I counted, like 6, 7 different kind of forms with different kind of functions. And I don't know whether there is any kind of tendency to simplify that. You mentioned something that based on Brazilian, there is a kind of tendency to use only 2 of them, the tu and você. Yes, tu and você. But I think that would be the natural way to go after all, you know, but I don't know how it will happen in that culture in the future. So very briefly, I think that we have had the opportunity to listen to some very interesting proposals here, and I think that as far as the cultural specificity of community style is concerned, absolutely Tatiana was right that what we have to do is to look into this cultural specificity, what is it like, and of course how it is represented when you use a language that is not your native tongue, basically, because that's the major question for me, how these social norms, how these community norms that exist in your language, in your first language, will change when you use not your native tongue, how the first language norms and standards will affect what's going on. And the importance of that kind of research that Tatiana presented here today is to actually see to what extent these particular categories change within one culture, and then what happens to them. The next step should be what happens to that in intercultural interactions, basically. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any comments any additional comments or observations that members of the panel would like to have? And also we would like to invite the members of the audience.
The criteria you used for the selection of the groups you have studied.
Yes?
The criteria you used for the selection of the groups.
Okay. Well, yeah.
They come from different cultures, but how about their age, their sex, their...
You mean the informants?
Yes, yes.
Okay, they're all over 18. Something like 90% are studying at university.
Yes.
So they all have this cultural background. And of course all of them speak 2 or more languages. Yeah. So that's, it's basically university students, all over the world, yes.
Okay.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
As for, may I say something? As for the no answers, I really inquired most of my students, why didn't they answer? They told me they didn't know. They didn't know the forms of address. So for them it's only tu and você, because it relates to their daily interaction. Then this is what they listen at home. This is what they listen in the news. So I would say
basically there is a very strong tendency to simplification.
To simplification, so reduction. But you, as I was saying, that there is a strong tendency and trend in the Portuguese language to go back to the patterns, to go back to the norm. And now there is this clash, this gap between the way people speak and in certain official situations, demanding official and the panoply of terms of address, and people are not prepared for this. So it is a factor of exclusion. So it reminds me of Britain before the 80s, where if you wouldn't speak British English, then you wouldn't be allowed to come to higher positions. So on the one hand, we simplify the language, but on the other hand, the formal setting of education doesn't give the panoply or the knowledge of all these forms, preparing people to survive in the Portuguese-speaking world. So, in the way, you're quite right. One thing is what is culture specificity, but in terms of Portugal, as it used to be an empire, we cannot have one culture. We have different cultures, but we have standardized it in the language and the way we convey meaning. But then
you talked about one variant of that language only,
which has not been well in the forms of address, Brazilian, Mozambique, Angola, Africa, and so on. All these in Macau, yes, in Macau, have been studied, but not Madeiran. And well, for me, it's been a clash. It's been a clash. For instance, I've been living on the island for 20 years now.
Good for you.
Good for me. Well, I don't know. It all depends. But sometimes people call me Cuban because Cuban is related to the revolution, as I am from Lisbon. So language as a factor. So if they call me Dona, then there's the factor of out-group relation. You don't belong here. Go back to your place. So this case.
But how do they know that you are not from there? You are not from
from my accent. From my accent.
Okay.
And if you call you Cuban?
No. Well, if I call them Cuban, no, there's no meaning for them. No. Why do they call me Cuban?
Yeah.
because it's related to revolution, and the revolution was 1974, so it was from a fascist country
It's
into
also outgroup.
outgroup marker, outgroup marker, and the same with comrade, yes. But then, well, intercultural. You talked about neighbor and friend. So when, in terms of hedging commitment and being, well, neutrality, or among youngsters, you say meu, which came up into my corpus, meu, amen, in Portuguese. But we can friend, vizinho, which is neighbor, comrade, velho amigo, but then it came up, for instance, I'm a Rotarian, and among Rotarians there are no social classes, no professional classes, and we say companion. So,
which is like comrade.
Which is like comrade, and it's not. So in our, if I say companheiro, then in my group, so for sometimes we have meetings open to the outside community, and I don't say engineer this or doctor that, I say companheiro this and companheiro that, but then I have to explain, because companheiro is someone with whom you live.
You mentioned menina as a group inclusive term.
Yes, inclusive term, yes, yes. And social rank as well is menina. Okay. So, but it's very difficult to, when it comes Portuguese for foreigners, it's very difficult to teach all these terms of address. But I have a Vietnamese colleague who is a linguist, and I was told that in Vietnamese the forms of address are much more complex.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
Much
They have
more complex.
7 pronouns. of the
Seven
second person.
pronouns and then forms of address.
That's a tonal
and verbs.
language, you know, so everything depends on
yes,
the tone.
A tone, yes, that's right, that's right. Okay, thank you.
Can I ask the members of the audience whether there are any more questions? In that case, can I just quickly, that can probably be our final point, can I just quickly go back, to the issue of pedagogy, of language learning? We had a couple of presentations in the morning, and we discussed, and we do discuss it sort of on a general basis, not just obviously on this panel, but generally speaking, we are all not necessarily worried, but we do wonder how best to didacticize all these issues, how actually to teach our students, either through, obviously, our language classes, but some of us do teach intercultural communication or intercultural pragmatics. And there is always a question, what exactly does that mean in practical terms to be fully, how to raise intercultural awareness, and what does exactly that mean? What is the final, can I call it a learning outcome, basically? What exactly do we want to achieve? How do we know that our students are successful or not? Could I just suggest, can we quickly share our views, ideas? Do we have any stand? Do we have any particular, approach or any particular view on that? Or simply do we sort of take, each classroom or each, individual student in his or her own right and simply devise? Yeah,
the real significance of the comparative type of studies that today there were 3 probably is in their pedagogical way, but this is where they can be used.
Absolutely.
This is where they can be used, because definitely when you teach English and you are in Portugal or Poland or wherever you are, and whatever the first language of your students is, then definitely you can make a comparison starting from the English text that, okay, this is what they do and this is what we do. Okay? So I think that the pedagogical value is there. So that was the reason basically why, as I say, there have been hundreds of studies like that, to use those findings for language teaching purposes, because this is where their real value is, that demonstrates that, okay, there are differences how people approach particular phenomena, like politeness is a universal phenomenon, but actually how it is expressed in different languages, it's another other issue. Of course, there is a danger there that it's one thing that you explain that to your students, it's another thing whether they are ready to do that, and there is another thing whether they are ready to accept, to behave that particular way in the target language, because there might be certain things that they just reject, you know, and they don't want to do that, and they don't want to behave that way in spite of the fact that they are aware of what the right expression is, but nobody would say something like, I suppose in Russian, that would you mind telling me what the time is, unless you practice that in the classroom, and of course, you know, a student can kind of repeat it all right, but if there is some kind of a task where they have to act in one way or another, I doubt that they will use that particular formula, for example. You know?
I very often have, thank you for mentioning
Unless they understand how important it is.
How important it is.
And why. So that's why I think this culture-specific communicative style will help us to systematize these differences, not just to teach them particular patterns and particular situations, but to give some general view on differences, and also it is necessary to explain through culture why. And I have just a very good background from my students who said that we had been taught for 5-6 years to say, would you mind? But we never did it because we couldn't understand why we should. But now we understand. And of course this problem, whether they are going to use such patterns or not, I also understand that I don't enforce them to do that. It's your choice. But if you want to behave, to do as the Romans do, and to be accepted in the society, perhaps you should modify your communicative strategies and behavior according to the target communicative style. If you won't just be as abrupt and rude and show your Russian mentality and face some communicative difficulties, because of that, you are most welcome. And as I said in my presentation, that at least, so here you may choose whether you want to follow these communicative strategies or not of the new language and culture or not, but at least this knowledge understand people, to help them to understand the communicative intentions, of their other culture interlocutors.
But exactly, I think you said the key thing, you know, it is up to them.
They may be polite or they may be rude, but they should be conscious, should be aware.
Absolutely. And it is ultimately something they should be comfortable with, I would say. So you do not change your own personality. So if you are naturally, let's say, I don't know, a bit more, exactly, you are not going to change it. So in a sense, I do have this, it is a common problem, or it is a common situation. My students tell me, for example, you know, British students who study foreign languages, when they go, let's say, to Spain or Italy or France for the year abroad, very often this is precisely the situation. You know that you have to be a bit more direct. So you know when you go to Spain, you can just say un café without anything else. But they say it is sometimes a struggle, at least for the first time. You're forced almost to say, be a bit more polite. You cannot just go and say un café.
There is a very, very serious danger here when occasionally it may happen that we put more culture into these expressions that actually there is. You know, because like in American English, you know, we say, how are you doing? But nobody gives a dime how we are doing, so you know, there is no culture. There is just a kind of functional expression. You know, so, and many people, like, you know, use expressions like kick the bucket, but nobody can explain to you. There is culture behind that. But you actually don't know, or piece of cake, you know, something, you know, expressions like this, where, you know, people think that there is some culture. Of course, all these expressions are rooted in the culture. The question is whether that kind of culture background has still some kind of psychological reality for the native speaker or not. And usually, many times there is no psychological reality of that, only the function of the expression period.
Yes. I believe our time is up. I would like to thank once again all our participants, and obviously very special thanks to Professor Kecskés for
Thank you for
accepting
inviting
our
me.
invitation to be our discussant. Thanks once again. Many thanks to our audience for being so patient. And, you know, it's been a long day, but it's been an utter pleasure for me, at least.
Thank
to
you
see
to
you all here.
Svetlana
Thanks so
for
much.
organizing
Thank you.
this. Yeah.
Thank you.